Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's event. I'm Kristen Schilt. I'm the faculty director for the Center for the Study of Gender and Sexuality at the University of Chicago, and I'm really excited to be able to introduce our speakers for today. If you're just joining us for this event for the first time, this is the fourth virtual panel in a series we've been doing to rethink the 1973 special issue of the American Journal of Sociology about the status of women, changing women in a changing society. So today we'll be talking about gender policing and the state, and I'm so excited to introduce our panelists. I'll just say we will be having our panelists answer a series of questions, and then we'll move to a Q&A at the end from the audience. So at any point, you're welcome to put your questions in the Q&A. And we hope that we'll be able to respond to all those questions as we go through. So our speakers today are Susila Gurusami, who is an assistant professor of criminology, law, and social justice at the University of Illinois in Chicago. We have Shannon Malone Gonzalez, who's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina, and Saher Selod, who's associate professor of sociology at Simmons University. And our discussion today will be moderated by Anna Fox, who's a doctoral student in sociology here at the University of Chicago. So please join me in welcoming our speakers, and I will turn this over to Anna.
Thank you, Kristen, for the introduction. It's so great to be moderating this panel of amazing scholars, and thank you all for being here today. It's going to be a really good conversation. So to kick us off, could you each tell us about your most recent work? We're especially interested in hearing about the communities you work with, where you do your work geographically, and your methodological approach. So Shannon, would you start us off?
Yes, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited about this conversation. I haven't gotten a chance to meet these two scholars in person, but I deeply admire their work, so I'm excited to have a conversation via Zoom. So for me, I'm really interested in looking at processes of silence around Black women's experiences of violence. And for me, geographically, the South is super important, not just because I'm from here, but I'm really interested in kind of how our histories and lived experiences shape how we've experienced policing and how we talk about it intercommunally within our own families and communities, how we address it. And so for me, I'm really interested in kind of these unnamed experiences, these unrecognized experiences of violences that don't get reported to institutions, and how police contact is kind of conditioned on these other types of violence we experience, such as domestic violence in Black families and communities. And so from that lens, for me, methodologically and epistemologically, it was really important to learn from and listen to Black women's stories. So if these experiences aren't being reported, if they're not being discussed openly, then Black women are carrying these stories with them. And I found many times in my interviews with them that this was the first time that anyone had asked them about their own encounters of police. And so it was also the first time they had an opportunity to reflect on the impact of that encounter openly with someone else. So really centering Black storytelling and how we process and understand our experiences of violence. And right now I'm working with an organization called Root Wellness Center in North Carolina, which is a Black feminist organization of psychologists and therapists who really center abolition and liberation psychology. And so really creating these kind of healing circles for Black women to be able to come together and gather and process their experiences of state violence and community.
Thank you. Susila, would you like to go next?
Sure. And thank you so much for having me. And I think it feels so exciting to be in conversation with both Dr. Malone Gonzalez and Dr. Selod, because their work is, I think, really emblematic of how racialized and gendered violence, how they're co-constituted, how we have to be thinking about these things as happening at the same time and as relational, and my work, I think, is happening in two related streams. And the first is it comes out of my dissertation work I'm currently working on my book manuscript, which is tentatively called Criminalized Black, or Nothing is Impossible, Criminalized Black Mothers Ending Incarceration. So that work, it comes out of an ethnographic and interview study, and the book is inclusive of that work as well as legal analysis and news studies of how criminalized Black mothers in particular navigate not just their experiences after incarceration, but how they make sense of their experiences of criminalization and doing this survival work that is in many ways made impossible, but they're doing it anyway, right? Because oftentimes because there is no other choice. But what I argue is that that's actually a blueprint towards working for abolition. That if we can pay attention to what it means, not just to survive as an individual under these impossible conditions of violence, then we actually have quite a lot of information about what it means to advance a world without policing, prisons, and punishment, and how essential that is for all of us. So that work really focuses on the narratives and storytelling of formerly incarcerated Black women. And so I really am looking to help to make sense of that within this growing movement to abolish prisons, policing, and jail, and how criminalized Black mothers are essential to imagining the end of incarceration and ultimately achieving it. And then I have a second stream of work, which is theory-based and written in collaboration with sociologists Rocio Garcia and Dia Bose, who are also feminist sociologists of color. And we look at how women of color feminisms are policed in the academy. And our most recent article is called Abolishing Carceral Distractions. And I'm going to talk about that more later as our discussion progresses.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And Saher, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. And it's, amazing to be in conversation with these two brilliant scholars. So I'm super excited about this. So I kind of come at this from a very different place. My work has been, my past work was on racialized surveillance of Muslim Americans. And so I have a book that I published, which examined the experiences of South Asian and Arab Muslim Americans in the years after 9/11. So for this project, for the second project, I was interested in examining how Black and African American Muslims are experiencing surveillance and how they're what they were encountering in comparison to South Asian and Arab Muslims. So that's where the policing kind of comes in. So I've been interviewing, I have 41 interviews to date with African American, Black immigrant, South Asian, and Arab Muslims. And I started this project. I was initially collaborating with a colleague who was the reason I got into this. He's a political scientist, but he left academia. So I took over the project, and we started the interviews over Zoom actually because of COVID, and over the phone because it was right when COVID hit that we started to get these interviews. So geographically, we opened it up to Muslims across the country. Initially, we were just going to look at Muslims in Boston, and we were able to sort of just shift. So I'm not limited to geography, but I've done a significant amount in Boston and in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which is where I'm from. So my work is really examining how African American and Black immigrant Muslims are encountering policing in a different way than South Asian and Arab Muslim Americans, and how South Asian and Arab Muslim Americans are actually encountering, surveillance from the FBI in the name of national security. So I'm sort of looking at how the war on drugs and the war on terror are colluding in these interesting ways. And gender definitely plays a huge role in how men and women have very different experiences with this. So, yeah.
Thank you. This is all such exciting work. The emergence of the movement for Black Lives in 2014 brought renewed attention to the progressive political goal of police abolition and ushered in more conversations across the country about defunding the police and funding mental health services. But at the same time, pro-police sentiments continue to be high in many parts of the country. How have these competing cultural ideas impacted your research, and what have you seen in the field? And we'll start with Susila.
Okay, so I actually want to start with a quote, and my plan was to put it in the chat, but I'm realizing now that maybe everyone can't see it. I'm going to put it there, so maybe if the hosts have the ability to send it out. Okay, looks like it's too long, so I'm just going to read it anyway. So this is a quote from, it's an excerpt from Angela Davis's Are Prisons Obsolete that I think really captures that tension for me, and that it's one that really has driven so much of my work. So she writes, prior to the emergence of the prison as the major form of public punishment, it was taken for granted that violators of the law would be subjected to corporal and frequently capital penalties. What is not generally recognized is the connection between state-inflicted corporal punishment and the physical assaults on women in domestic spaces. This form of bodily discipline has continued to be routinely meted out to women in the context of intimate relationships, but it's rarely understood to be related to state punishment. So that quote for me does a lot of work to identify how carceral feminisms are, abolition feminists building from these Black radical traditions, identify as seeking redress and punishment through the law as a solution for gender-based violence and harm. So how that often comes from an attempt to protect vulnerable populations from violence. But if we think about how carceral feminists are looking to punish people who, for instance, cause sexual violence with incarceration, we have to remember that incarceration also weaponizes sexual violence by design, right? So even basic conditions that we take for granted as part of incarceration, like strip and cavity searches, are forms of state-sponsored gender and sexual violence. So as long as we're envisioning the solutions to sexual violence as more sexual violence, we can't meaningfully address the roots or causes or really claim to be committed to ending sexual violence. So that, I think that conceptual anchor, thinking about what would it really take to not just challenge or partially address these forms of gender-based violence that are also rooted in racial violence and colonialism and settler colonialism. How can we think about this more expansively than simply punishment, right? Because punishment does not end those forms of violence. And I think when we look to the state, and particularly when we look to policing for those solutions, we end up reproducing so many of those problems. And so that's a lot of, I think that captures the undercurrent in my work. And so I think the push to look to policing, right? Or look to policing as a solution, that's so much of what I look to challenge in my work. So Rocio Garcia and Dia Bose and I do that in our Abolishing Carceral Distractions article. And we really try to think about how it's not just folks, it's not to say that, explicit white supremacy isn't a big part of that driver, but we're really looking at, okay, if you care about racial and gender justice, then thinking about policing as a solution that still reproduces those same problems, but it makes it seem on the surface like a real solution. So we really think about how, or what we are thinking about collectively, and what I think I try to do in my work individually is how we can reposition our approach from carceral solutions and punishments as normal, desirable solutions of social problems, how we can challenge that us versus them, safe versus dangerous people approach that I think really shows up in a lot of social science research from folks who really care about racial violence, who really care about ending racial and gender violence and harm, but how, because those are such standard approaches to making arguments for safety, where do we end up leaving people behind who are the people who end up getting sacrificed in the name of a convincing argument? And so I think for me, what I look to do is shift my own approach to say, it's not about folks who are pro-policing versus folks who want to see the end of policing. There's actually quite a lot of variation in between, but that variation and the folks who are often advocating for lesser violence, that can do its own type of harm as well. And we have to take that seriously, because the folks who are on the margins are the ones who end up, becoming disposable, becoming those who are considered collateral damage in those broader, in a broader argument that might seem on the surface more convincing to more people. So I think that that's really impacted not just how I do my research, but also how I'm engaging my students, how I think about what this work means beyond the academy itself. And I think, and I was surprised by this as well, now being in a criminology department versus a sociology department, a lot of my students want to join law enforcement or envision themselves as becoming law enforcement officers because they care about the communities that they're part of. And they want to see safety and justice in those spaces. So being able to make that legible to them that, you care, and these are folks you don't want to leave people behind. So what would that really take, right? How do we have to confront some very difficult ideas about harm and violence and really address how that's rooted in anti-Blackness, how that's rooted in gender policing, how that's rooted in particular ideas about sexual violence, even if it feels very uncomfortable to address those things, and that the solutions are not going to be one size fit all, and they're not going to be easy policy answers. So I think that that's my sort of long extended answer to that question, but I do think it's about nuancing that, that binary between abolition and policing to consider, well, there's stuff in the middle that can also do unintended harm and violence.
Thank you. Saher?
That was a great answer. And I'm going to kind of go off that a little bit and veer a little bit in a different direction just because my work is different. But yeah, I think that the point that Dr. Gurusami is making that's very important is the nuance in here. So I can speak to the interviews that I've done. There's a wide variation in how the populations that I've talked to view policing. So, for example, every single African American Muslim that I talk to has very little trust in the police and has stated will not call the police unless it's like absolutely necessary to call the police. So, and then on the flip side, I have interviewed Pakistani and Indian American Muslims, and they've said they absolutely would call the police and they trust the police and they want the police. And so this is all, tied to, different histories, different experiences, different neighborhoods, and different encounters with the police, like the way that the police treat them. And it is very different based on their racial and ethnic identities. And gender as well. That plays a huge role in it too. So I'm, talking to people, and so some are not on the abolition, they're not for that. They're actually for policing because they feel safer with police in their communities. And so it's pretty complicated in terms of, even, and I will say I'm part of a fellowship, and there are a lot of different people involved in this fellowship. They're advocacy, activists, scholars, lawyers, and they're all, looking at Muslims and policing and how do we deracialize national security or or security. And even those groups fall on, they're advocating for different things. Some people absolutely want to, don't want to defund or abolish the police. So I agree with what, was just said. There's a lot of nuance in identifying the harm that is done through more policing. We need to examine that. So, for example, the African-American men and women who are Muslim who I talk to don't feel targeted by the war on terror like the South Asian and Arab Muslims that I'm talking to. Yet what they don't understand is the war on terror is funneling money into local policing and into, surveillance of their communities. And so trying to, make them aware of the ways in which, there are connections, and they may not think that they're being targeted in this way, but yet they are, because they're being stopped anytime they're in a car or they're being policed in their neighborhoods. So it's really nuanced. And I think that one thing that I'll end with that I was really surprised at, and I'm going to do more interviews on this, is I was just in Texas for Eid, and I was in the mosque, and South Asian and Arab Muslims in mosques are very fearful of shooters coming in and committing acts of violence while they're congregated there. And one of the things they did was they gave awards to the security in the mosque. And I was like, wait, what? So now mosques, and I knew this was kind of happening, I didn't realize to what extent, have their own security, because they used to hire police to make them feel more secure, but that became too expensive for them. So I started asking around, like, who's the security? Well, they're collaborating with the police around, this internal security, which makes me think of the Nation of Islam and internal security practices that were happening for very different reasons and different relationships with the local police. So I think that it's not as simple as people fall on abolishing it or supporting it. I think there's a lot of nuance here that we really need to explore. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you. And Shannon?
Yeah, I think that's a great place for me to pick up, and just thinking about the nuance in the stories of the Black women that I spoke with. So I will say that for the most part, none of them advocated for more police. And when they talk about issues of safety, it gets very complicated. So I think in some ways, they recognize that police does not necessarily make them or their community safer. But I think it's a lot of people's knee-jerk go-to when you don't have other systems or institutions in place. And they're dealing with violence on a lot of different fronts. They're dealing with neighborhood violence. They're dealing with domestic violence. And so who do you call if you don't call the police? And so I think one of the biggest takeaways that I saw was that, like, we can't have this conversation. Abolition is a both and of, like, taking away prisons and police, but also building up these support services. And we have to be doing both at the same time. Otherwise, I think we make people more vulnerable within their own communities to other forms of violence. And I think particularly I saw that around domestic violence, being fearful of calling the police, not wanting to cause more harm to their families or communities, but not knowing who then to turn to. And so one of the things that I'm looking at now and ongoing is kind of, particularly in the South, there's a long history of mutual aid supports. There's a long history of providing resources to communities because you can't access these traditional institutions. And so how are Black women able to mobilize these, like, traditional mutual aid networks and supports? And in what ways are they ostracized from them because of their gender and the particular nature of the silences around domestic violence or other forms of violence that necessarily maybe the Black church isn't organizing around in particular ways? And I think also when thinking about I think one of you said, like, who's left behind? That's where I start to see some nuance. So I think when people are pushing reforms such as, like, community policing or diversifying the police department, what I saw is that really puts Black women at risk, particularly of, I think, sexual violence, coercion, and retaliation in the long term. So I think the kind of ethos behind it is if you establish these relationships officers are less likely to use deadly force. But then if we're not thinking about sexual violence and the conditions in which like perpetuate sexual violence, Black women were very fearful of these community police officers, knowing where they lived, knowing where they worked, putting them at subject to more surveillance, being afraid of retaliation if they report those officers because they're centered in their community in different ways. So I think when we're thinking about who's left behind, we really, I think by centering those amongst us who are most vulnerable, we really see the limits of those policies and reforms that we push. And I think particularly that nuance, at least within the Black women that I talked to, came out amongst Black middle-class women who were proponents of community policing. But again, I think we can see the ways in which those officers aren't going to be placed in their neighborhoods. The ways in which they come into contact with police are different. And so in some ways it shows the more distance you have from the direct implications of those policies, the more likely you may be to lean on policing as the solution versus being really able to imagine alternatives for safety and support.
Thank you so much. And before we turn to our last question, just a reminder that you can put your questions for the panelists in the Q&A section of the Zoom. But for the last question, what role are sociologists playing in conversations about policing nationwide? And where do you think we need more research and action from sociology? We'll start with Saher.
Okay, so I knew I was going to get this question first. And this is something that like I feel like I'm really new to the policing literature. So I've spent the last few years or several years looking at more national security and the FBI and airport security and things like that for my first book and my first study. I would say that I know that the other two panelists will have much more to say about this, but I think that I'm seeing like the work of Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Gurusami looking at gender and policing, Beth Ritchie, those are the kinds of Victor Rios, Robert Vargas at Chicago. These are the people whose work I kind of have already been reading and looking at because they do intersectional analysis, something that doesn't look at policing as just from a quantitative analysis. So for me, it's really important that sociologists value qualitative research when it comes to studying policing or the impacts of policing, because I think a lot gets lost in the quantitative analysis. So you're getting more of that nuanced data that we need. I think a lot more work needs to be done. I'm not aware of very many people who are looking at specifically policing on Muslims, on a Muslim population. There are a few who have some, studies that are, I think, coming out or who have come out with some. But I would say, like, for me, in terms of sociologists, my work is so interdisciplinary that I'm constantly reading outside of my discipline. It just, I love sociology, but often it's very narrowly focused on one aspect. And I really don't think that has that's not how I analyze my research. Like, it's not just gender, it's not just race, these are really both important when we're talking about the ways in people experience discrimination or racism or policing or surveillance or what have you. So I will say, like, my very brief answer on this question is that there's a lot more, I feel like, research in sociology being done from criminologists that are super focused on the quantitative. And I think we need more scholars like the two on this panel who are doing rich qualitative research that are getting at the nuance of experiences around policing, that it's not just about mass incarceration and being arrested, for whatever, but that Black women are policed in different ways, that Muslims are experiencing policing and have very nuanced and different attitudes towards policing, for example. And that I think your last comment about, Black middle-class women saying, okay, I support community policing, that's come up in my work as well, that there are some, like I have a participant whose son was killed by the police and still supports community policing, so there's something that qualitative research gets to that I feel like quantitative research misses, and it's unfortunate that we see a lot of the funding going to the quantitative research versus funding, qualitative research. And the last thing I'll say is we also should be very, aware of where the funding is coming from, because a lot of it does come from the DOJ and the state is funding research on policing. And that's something that I think we should be very critical of as sociologists. So, yeah.
Shannon, would you like to go next?
So I will say that I really struggled with this question a lot. It really made me reflect. I am a sociologist, but I don't primarily see myself as a sociologist, if that makes sense. I feel like I often have to translate what I do for sociologists. And when I really think of my method, my epistemology, it's very much Black Southern storytelling and ways of sharing our information that aren't necessarily legitimated by methods and the way we conceptualize things in the academy. And so with that, I think in reflecting on that, I came away with like two things. I think one, we frame a lot of things in terms of access to communities. And I was constantly reminded of something my grandmother would say was just go where you're invited. And so oftentimes it's not an issue of access. And so it's about building relationships with communities. So I think sociologists need to do more community engaged research, do partnerships with communities, build relationships. Policing looks so different in so many different places. And so we can't talk about it the same, and the solutions will be different for each community. So what does it mean to actually build meaningful relationships and use our skills in ways that are community-driven research questions and agendas was one. And then I think the second piece is really around what we consider data. So I did a national survey on police violence against Black women as a part of my dissertation data as well. And one of the things that I realized is like the way we operationalize use of force is just not capturing Black women's experiences. So they would take the survey before the interview, they would indicate that they didn't have any experiences of police violence, and I made sure to use measures from traditional kind of policing surveys or violence surveys. And then we would get in the interviews and they would be sharing these stories that did not show up in the interview data. And so throughout the process, I was constantly going back and forth between shifting these measures to capture their experiences. And so I think what we can do as sociologists, and what I learned in the process, is if we're taking these kind of predetermined measures and then imposing them onto their experiences, we're doing a lot of epistemological harm. And we're not even capturing what we say, or we're capturing in the first place. And so what does it mean for us to be very attuned into the way people archive their own lived experiences? And then from there, how do we create measures from the ways in which they understand those experiences of harm? And how does that challenge how we traditionally think about police violence in these different ways?
Thank you. And Dr. Gurusami?
Thank you. I feel like I want to, my response, I want to bring together like 2 points from the previous responses. And so I think for me, the way that I think about policing is also not just as like the institution of policing, but what is the function of policing? And so thinking about what sociologists do around policing, whether it's as an institution or as a function, I think we are a discipline with many different political, ideological, and methodological attachments, and that shapes the incredible variety of work that we see around policing and sociology. So, I think in what Saher was saying about thinking about where the funding is coming from, I think we really do have to be cognizant that so many, not just sociologists, but academics in general, are acting as the state and doing the work as the state by virtue of the funding that we receive, right? And by virtue of the institutions that we're a part of. I mean, I'm part of a public university that also makes me part of the state, right? And so the particular ways that we're funded, the institutions that we're accountable to because we get resources from those places, I think we have to be very, very cognizant of. We have to be willing to bite the hand that feeds us. I think to do critical work around policing, punishment, and violence. So I think you do see plenty of sociologists who are really invested in doing work on how do we make policing better? And not just how do we make policing better, how do we make it more effective? Which is also another way of saying, how do we weaponize the state better against particular folks, right? Sometimes it's about creating a more precise way of policing particular populations, right? It again becomes this way of separating out the us versus them, who is actually safe versus who is actually dangerous. And that to me becomes one of the ways in which sociology is emblematic of some of the violence done by academics, and that where research can really validate these, these technologies of death and domestic and international warfare. And so, I certainly think we see a lot of sociologists who are doing that work. I think there's a lot of pressure that comes from the professionalization of academic work, of trying to coin a concept of having a career, of becoming a recognizable figure in the field that is also very much attached to those mechanisms as well. And I think having a critical eye towards that, and that many of us can do that even as we're trying to think about how to do justice work, really analyzing, well, who are we doing this for, right? And who are we doing this with? Who are we doing this in support of, right? And I think that without, there are many ways to actually do the violence of the state, even if it's accidental, if we're not constantly and hypercritical of the ways that we go about our work. So I certainly think that there are sociologists, of course, who are doing this work that is abolitionist, that is rooted in the core of community work and pursuing freedom and liberation. But I think also by virtue of being in the academy, we tend to fall into those traps more easily than many of us would like to admit. And so I think one of the things I would encourage sociologists in particular to think about is how our own normative, kind of taken for granted measurements that Shannon had talked about, right? How do we operationalize things, right? How do we operationalize terms? How are we analyzing them, right? How are our measurements and categories and commitments to legibility also doing that work of ideological and formal policing? So I think as a whole, we're also not necessarily pushed as much as others in some of the more interdisciplinary fields to think about the role of history in our contemporary conditions. So for me, like one of the most classic instances is thinking about how we talk about and measure gender, right? And that we don't often make explicit in our work how enslavement and anti-Blackness and settler colonialism are core to the way that we think about gender. And that impacts the lived experience today and the formal organization of gender in our carceral system. So I think it's really connecting those historical pieces in a deep and thoughtful way, and not just thinking about how do we measure what's happening now, but rather how are those measurements really shaped by what has happened a long time ago, and these sorts of, and that it's not actually that long ago if we think about tracing those logics into the present. But I think also, like our previous two panelists, I'm less concerned, I think, about the work we have to do as a discipline, and really more interested in what these commitments to freedom work looks like, regardless of where we're positioned. And I think conversations within sociology and the academy more broadly are a lot of the time just about justifying the existence of our profession and legitimizing it to others, whether it's internally or to those on the outside. And that itself for me functions as a carceral distraction. So I think part of what I would really push, especially junior scholars who are listening in, is to think about, if we're trying to do this work that's about people, we have to do it with and in support of people who really also are not interested in the politics of academia at all. And that is often, I think, very counter to the increasingly professionalized landscape of sociology.
Thank you. So let's open it up to the Q&A. And as a reminder, go to the Q&A thing at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. And our first question is related to the insufficiency of community policing for Black women, from Dr. Gonzalez. And the participant asks, for the middle-class Black women that supported community policing, what kinds of reasons did they give, and what did you make of them in relation to your other responses?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think a couple of things. I think one, in terms of, so there are differences across social class in the ways in which Black women encounter police in their day-to-day. And so a lot of them live in neighborhoods where they don't have to encounter them daily in their neighborhood, and the implications of what that means. So I feel like they're alienated from that aspect of it within their neighborhoods. Now, that does not mean they don't encounter police in other spaces or in other ways. But I think in terms of thinking about those implications of what it means to have the same officer in your neighborhood long-term, they haven't had to live with that within the context of their neighborhood. And I think that's really important to name when you're thinking about a policy. And then I think the other part of it is, I think in general, so I think there's two parts. I think in general, there's a kind of like police as a euphemism for safety that's like a broader discourse. And so I think if you actually, in some ways, probed and asked questions, which I did, you find that they actually aren't in support of those things. So I think sometimes people say those things because they're like, it's so normalized to do so. But when you actually get at the logics of what's underneath it, they had the opportunity to reflect on those things within the context of our interview many times for the first time. And so I actually found through the act of interviewing, some of the beliefs and logics that were held at the beginning were not necessarily the same ones held at the end. So the interview itself became this space for them to work through kind of their policies and policing when they haven't had an opportunity to actually discuss them. And then I think the third thing, I don't think I want to explicitly say all Black middle-class women weren't. And so I think that's where the importance of solidarity comes in. There were those Black middle-class women who were really doing the work to be in community with folks who have different lived experiences than them within their own community, within Black communities. And I think that kind of extended and challenged some of the frames in which they understood policing, understood their own experiences, and then they understood abolition as well.
Thank you. This question is for everybody, so call on people, but the participant asks, how do gender and racial factors manifest as significant challenges for individuals and groups in your research? And what are some examples of the impact of these factors on the research process and outcomes? So we'll start with Dr. Selod.
Okay, so I need to think about this for a second, but how do gender and racial factors manifest as significant challenges for individuals? Well, so for me, in the first study that I did, I really examined, and I apologize if I'm not answering the question correctly, so please, whoever asked, put it in the chat that you're asking something else. But just, I think like the ways in which, we think about discrimination, racism, policing, surveillance, all these things that we typically look at it through a lens where it's really looking at men's experiences with them. So, and they just are incredibly different. So, and when I first started teaching inequalities at Simmons, I used to use Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, to talk about mass incarceration. And then, stopped using that book and replaced it with Beth Ritchie's book, because everybody has heard about men's experiences when it comes to Black Lives Matter. That's what gets centered in our, national conversation. But what doesn't get centered is, or what we don't discuss, is that policing and surveillance operate in unique ways based on your race and gender and class, as you're referencing with in terms of community policing. So it's really important, for me, when I started interviewing Muslim men and women for the first study, their encounters in airports, and I've asked this question in this follow-up, this new study. I ask all the participants about their experiences in airports, for example, because Muslims are not uniformly having the same experience in airports. So there's a term, flying while Muslim, which does not impact African-American Muslim men in the same way that it does Arab Muslim men and South Asian Muslim men, especially if they haven't changed their names, because a lot of the people I interviewed were reverts or converts. So they still have anglicized names, and names are how Muslim men are targeted in airports because they're told their name is similar to a name on a terrorist database. And so that subjects them to hypersurveillance in airports. That wasn't happening with women. Women who wear the hijab are the ones who are stopped and searched in airports. Now things can change over time. These policies shift. But it's really important that we pay attention to the ways in which our racial and ethnic and gender identities are marking us in unique ways for policing and surveillance. So, and that policing, like, Dr. Gurusami was mentioning, is not just about this one narrow definition that we have of what policing looks like. Policing, citizens have been, in my work, I look at how citizens are sort of an arm of the state. They're encouraged to be a part of policing and watch people. So if you see something, say something. Your next door group or what have you, your doorbells with the cameras on them, and I know, Dr. Gonzalez, you're looking at in your work how phones can be used to resist it in some ways. So it's really important that we recognize, because if we are looking to change policies and the ways in which things are done in this country and policing and surveillance and the FBI and all this, we have to know how they're targeting people. So race and gender are incredibly important to look at. And so we don't have this one experience guiding the knowledge and the epistemology that we produce, which we hope, I'm assuming all of us hope, that this work is going to be used to dismantle these systems of oppression that we're studying. So that's my response.
Thank you. Dr. Gurusami, would you like to go next?
Sure. And I think likewise, if I'm not getting at the core of the question, please let me know. So I think some of the ways that it's important to note that, I think in everyday lived experiences, particularly in my, the work I'm doing for my book, I focus on the experiences of formerly incarcerated Black women. And almost no one is saying this happened to me because I am a Black woman, right? It's the context itself in which criminalization becomes possible, right? Where it is that intersection of race, of gender, of socioeconomic status, of also location in the city, right? So my work focuses on Los Angeles and living in South LA or South Central LA, and the particular ways in which people are encountering policing, the ways in which they become criminalized, right? Many women were criminalized consistent with Beth Ritchie's work, right? Where they were vulnerable to or experienced gender-based violence or intimate partner violence, and whatever they were arrested for was in connection to their abuse, right? That becomes a trigger moment for incarceration, right? And to begin a process of formal criminalization. Some were following that, so they would have something on their record, and then they wouldn't be able to get a job. They would steal something from Walmart for $2 for their kid. And then that it was during California's when 3 strikes was still in effect. So those were things that would lead to someone's long-term incarceration, potentially with that for life sentence added on. And so there were many ways, I think, in which race and gender impacted the mechanism of criminalization, but they're often not named that way, right? And we can only understand that because so much of it, I think, the work on women's incarceration and criminalization does just talk about women as a whole without thinking about the racial specificities and how that criminalization happens, right? And so much of the time in many urban spaces in the US, that is through anti-Blackness. It is through settler colonialism in places where Native and Indigenous populations are larger, right? And that anti-Indigenous sentiment becomes more explicit. But it's also the ways that, you know, consistent with Dorothy Roberts' work, how do women in particular and mothers in particular become vulnerable through these multiple types of institutions, whether it's through the child welfare system, whether it's through the medical system, whether it's through their kids' school, right? So there are so many moments of vulnerability that also emerge from the web of criminalization and surveillance and punishment that's present in Black women's lives. Particularly if they are socioeconomically vulnerable, if they've already been criminalized, or if someone in their family or close networks is already under surveillance. So I think one of the ways that I think about this is that it's not just about the moment of criminalization, it's also about what led to that, right? What are the multiple sorts of orchestrated traps that exist where Black women are caught, but oftentimes because the literature on incarceration, when it does focus on women, is often deracialized in ways that is not actually true to people's experiences. So I think it is really important to be attentive to the ways that, you know, race is gendered and gender is race, right? We have to talk about gender racialization. And we also have to, I think, these are things that I didn't pay attention to in my research, thinking about like that gender is also not a binary. And I am now having to think about the implications of that in what the findings of my work are, because I wasn't attentive to thinking about race outside of a binary. And that doesn't map onto people's lived experience, right? And the ways that women experienced further criminalization while they were incarcerated for having relationships with other women or for having relationships with trans men while they were incarcerated. So there's so many ways I think that this shows up in the work, but also we have to ask, I think, particular questions to be aware of those impacts as well. And I think, you know, speaking for myself, those were things that I wasn't attentive to at the time that I'm now having to retroactively try to think through because I was constrained by the limits of my own imagination at the time and my own sort of political references. So it shows up, I think, in so many different ways. And in terms of the way it bears out on the research of process and outcomes, a lot of this is me thinking back to, okay, I would have done this differently, or I wish I would have asked this differently, or been attentive to this, or even just considered the circumstances through a different frame. What would it have meant had I gone into this work thinking about the historical conditions of anti-Blackness and the ways that Black women have experienced policing and punishment as a, you know, as this sort of long historical continuation from chattel slavery to the present. And I think that that also would have pushed me to ask very different questions. So I think some of this is, I can see how these things unfold. People are rarely talking about it in these explicit terms. And without that historical context, the meaning is often lost or becomes a little bit more obscure. Not a little bit more, it becomes a lot more obscure. So I think some of the work of also this research process is to think about the moments of meaning making that I had neglected at the outset.
Thank you. And Dr. Gonzalez?
Yeah, I think, oh, there's so much here. I'm like trying to take notes as well at the same time. I think one of the, so two things. I think one, I love this framing of as like as a trigger moment coming off of Beth Ritchie's work. And what I'm finding in my own work is domestic violence is also a trigger moment for police contact for Black middle-class women. And that's not talked about often. And what I found from interviewing them and actually pulling in Black middle and upper middle-class women's stories, a lot of their moments of police contact and then subsequent police violence was triggered by domestic violence in their own home. So thinking about the specific pathways through which Black women come into contact with police. And then I also think about the epistemological work of gender. And the implications for not just Black women, but for other people and populations as well. And so for me, thinking when we center Black women, I heard their stories of sexual violence and sexual harassment and the ways in which those are hidden from others and those around them for very different reasons, right? From social sanctions, from shame, from respectability, from blame. So there's a lot of different reasons and why they hide their experiences of sexual violence with officers. But I also think this gendering of sexual violence has implications for Black men as well. And I'm thinking about like Paul Butler's work, like we don't know as much about Black men's experiences of police sexual violence, right? And so I think there is these work that these processes are doing as well that obscure these experiences for some populations while making them hyper visible against others. And so I think when we center different populations, we start to think about lived experiences, I don't think discriminate. You know, people can become victims of sexual violence across the gendered spectrum. But we talk about them in specific ways for different people based on the ways in which they're gendered. And so I'm really thinking through this kind of work that it's doing as well in terms of policing the frames that we use to talk about violence.
Thank you all. And one of our participants asks, I'm wondering how sociologists can be helping develop communities that center justice rather than carcerality. How can we use our work with community partners to create more solidaristic community rather than shoring up the state? And Dr. Gurusami, do you want to start?
I will give this one a shot, I think in part by saying, I don't know, and because I also don't think that there's a singular answer. I think we're all positioned differently. And I think for some of us working with communities, and communities are, we know that there is like no singular definition of community, even though like in the academy, we tend to sort of say like the academy and the community, that can mean so many different things, right? So, you know, I think centering justice also in part, and thinking about something Shannon said earlier, you know, we go where we're invited. So part of this also matters, like where are we invited and where are we imposing ourselves, right? And I think academics have a long history and habit of imposing ourselves where we should not be and where we are not invited and where we're not welcome. And that's in part because I think many academics go into spaces with ideas about what needs to happen rather than listening to folks who have often been saying for a very long time, this is what's happening here, right? If we think about a lot of the work on documenting racial inequality and racial violence, documentation matters, right? Research matters, but we also know that especially in cases of violence by law enforcement against Black folks, people have been saying this for a long time, right? So I think some of that work of partnership also really takes evaluating, well, where is it actually a partnership? And also where are academics, like I think about Harney and Moten, and part of our job as academics, as people have access to these academic institutions, is to take our resources and figure out how to give them to folks and let other people decide how that gets used, right? Sometimes that can mean something as simple as saying, hey, I have access to this university space by virtue of having, this, faculty or graduate student position. Do you need it for a meeting? I can book it for you, right? I think it means opening up what often becomes these really insular these insular spaces and saying like, we actually don't have the right to decide who should be here and who shouldn't. And so much of the work of policing, particularly that the university does, is deciding who should be on campus and who shouldn't, right? Showing your campus ID to be in a particular space. That I think is especially, I think Devarian Baldwin talks about, you know, in his book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, how universities do the work of governance through policing, right? Through determining how space is used in urban centers, right? So I think some of this is about how do we push back against those things and really look to give those spaces back in ways that are often uncomfortable for academics, and that also challenge many of the norms about what academic space are. But so many of those things about, I think, centering justice rather than carcerality, some of this also means we rethink how we run our classrooms, right? We rethink how, you know, where are the police in our hearts and minds, right? Paulo Rojas said that. So I think I had to also really revisit so many of my teaching practices and think about, well, where is surveillance and punishment embedded in even how I engage my students? Teaching on Zoom, if I require them to keep their cameras on, right? Like, I'm requiring them to engage in a certain way where their spaces are then being policed, where I'm surveilling them, where I'm seeing also when they're accessing certain materials. How can I teach them to invert those tools, or to show them at least how those tools have been used against them or could be? So I think that there are so many levels of, like, we can think about this at the level of pedagogy. We can think about this at the level of, like, what are we doing in our jobs, whether that's in research or things that we do because of our jobs that take away from other spaces that we might operate in differently. And I really do think, for me, a lot of the time it comes back to the importance of, like, biting the hand that feeds us, I think, is one way of saying it, but really saying, like, what are we doing here if we care about justice? A lot of the time that's going to mean abolition doesn't just mean, you know, tearing things down. It means building up. But I think in the academy, we really do have to think about, well, what has to be torn down here? Is this a structure that's salvageable? And I think a lot of the time we're going to get the answer that it's not. So what are we doing in the work of trying to recover our disciplines or infuse the academy? I think that there are useful tools from research, but I don't necessarily know what that would look like in all spaces or in all moments. But I think in general, it demands a different type of allegiance, and not to, you know, the professional work that we do or the professional organizations or spaces that we're in. And I think it really demands that we do that. Also less of the self-congratulatory, this like work that I think academics tend to be very invested in. So I think that's my short answer. I think we'll all be differently positioned and differently situated to challenge those conditions of carcerality where we're at.
Thank you. Dr. Gonzalez?
Whew, I don't even know. Like you said, all the things. So I think for me, I keep going back to, I agree. I don't know if academia is salvageable, because at the core of it is like the power to legitimate knowledge, while at the same time saying other people's knowledge practices are illegitimate. And so I think being okay with that tension while positioned within the academy. And at the same time, I love this idea of allegiance and being willing to say no and deal with the consequences of that. Like, I think is really important. And then I also think everything doesn't have to make its way into research, public research. I think for me, that's a Black Southern epistemology, and it's also like a part of liberation work. Everything doesn't belong to the academy. And so there are certain ways of resisting and producing knowledge that should not be seen. And that's because there is a longer term goal, an allegiance to freedom and liberation. So I think in allying yourself with community, being in constant conversation with ourselves about, am I bringing my resources and skills into this place, and not looking to take anything from it in terms of what we can produce and make public, I think is really important.
Thank you, Dr. Selod.
Thanks. Yeah. So I guess I agree with everything that both of the panelists have said so far. And I think it's really important to think about our institutions and where policing occurs in those institutions and how that policing is not, it does not make campuses safe for everybody. And that's really the whole thing that, I think my work and I think a lot of us are looking at is that policing, tying it back to like white supremacy, is meant for white people, and to make them feel safe. And and it results in lots of different communities of color, but of course not in the same way, to feel less safe in that space. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that for me, just kind of, I feel like I've started to do work with organizations that are doing the work, that are not sociologists and they're not academics. So I am getting, I'm going to promote an organization right now, the Muslim Justice League, that does abolitionist work in Boston, and it's Muslim run, and it makes the connections between policing and surveillance and, the war on terror. And I think that, I've invited them to my classes over the years because they're doing the on the ground work that I call them superheroes. They're doing because they're very, a very small number of people doing, this work around, getting certain practices like, fusion centers in Boston. They're bringing attention to, this sort of the surveillance that people really aren't paying attention to, that are impacting actually a largely Black population in Boston, that's done in the name of preventing terrorism. So, I think I've invited them to my classes to speak, and given, I bring them to campus and I talk about them in all of my talks. And now I'm working with them. I'm on their board now. And I think that's part of the work that we need to be doing. And it kind of like, to go off of what was said, like, are you doing this work for your own personal and professional gain? Or are you doing this work because you really think that we need to dismantle these systems that are really problematic? And so, you can do it in your classroom, like, you just talked about, do it in your classroom, do it on campus, pay attention to policing practices on your campus. Like, I just found out that on my campus, when someone is having a mental health crisis, that they're forced to go with the campus police. They are the ones to escort them. And for our Black students, this is something that causes more stress and anxiety. So I think that you can do it in those ways, but you could certainly write reports, make your work legible. It doesn't all have to go in a journal article or even in a book. Make it put it out there where people can use it. And so there are lots of different ways sociologists can expand their work, make their work more public facing, find organizations. What I found with advocacy organizations and activist organizations is that they don't want to read your book. They don't have time to read your book. So you need to translate things very quickly for, and in a short, readable piece that helps them. And there's lots of work we can do with our spare time. I know there's not a lot of it, so this is a lot of weekend mornings that I'm, doing some of this work, but I think it's really important that, that if you really are doing this, because, and this kind of will tie into the second question, but my positionality is that this stuff impacts me personally and my community and my family. And, so that's why, like, I have a lot of skin in the game with this work. So it, I can speak to academics, but I really am interested in dismantling these systems that are deeply racialized and problematic and oppressive. So that's my answer. Yeah.
And we have one last question before we have to wrap it up, that you just gestured to, but a participant asks, could you speak to the ways in which your own positionality impacted the research process? And examples from your data and ongoing research projects would be the most useful. And so we'll start with Dr. Gonzalez.
I think it impacted it in a lot of ways. I think in some ways it was so I will say this, it was very clear that had I not also been a Black woman, I would not be listening to their stories. I had participants tell me they stayed in their cars and they waited to make sure that I wasn't a white Shannon. I had participants tell me that they would not explicitly say that they would not have shared their stories if I wasn't also a Black woman as well. And I think for me throughout, one of the things that I realized is there's such a history and systemic issue around epistemic violence for Black women, having to justify their experiences, fears of being blamed and shamed. And so in a lot of ways, our interviews were a space where they let me know their histories of not only police violence, but epistemic violence around being able to name the experiences of violence throughout their lives. And I think that's really important to pay attention to. I think there's a lot of calls for Black women to speak and share their stories. And there needs to be more calls, in my experience, of getting people ready and prepared to listen and respond appropriately to when Black women speak and share their stories. It's not necessarily that they aren't speaking, but there's histories there of pushback, of blame within the context of the organizing that they're doing, within the context of their family discussions on policing, within the context of their schools, and within the context of their jobs. And so I think, at least for me, the way my positionality showed up is there was an expectation that I would be aware of that type of process and therefore would do no harm and ask them to justify. They didn't want to have to tell their stories and explain their stories. And at the same time, justify their stories against potential judgment. That's a lot of layers in the process of storytelling. So I found my positionality allowed them to just tell their stories.
Thank you. And Dr. Gurusami?
So, I think there were so many ways that my positionality impacted my experience of doing ethnographic work for, what shows up in my book. I'm South Asian American. I was in my mid-20s when I was doing my field work. And I think for me, one of the big tensions that I was navigating at that time was, how do I not be intrusive, right? Because ethnography is so intrusive. It is so, it's surveillance, right? And I think for me, being attentive to that was also not going where I wasn't invited. It was, I think, pushing back against folks who I think were well-meaning in mentorship, who would say, like, invite yourself over for dinner, right? Invite yourself into people's homes, go to, see what people are doing on Easter and Christmas. I was like, I'm not going to invite myself into those spaces, right? Go where you're invited. And for me, that meant also, as someone with a car, one of the only useful things I was able to do for people was drive them around to the millions of appointments they had to take across South LA. And not just across South LA, from South LA to East LA, and all the different types of appointments that folks who are on parole or probation have to do, or if they're trying to get their kids back, sometimes it meant like babysitting people's kids in my car while they were at an appointment, right? So I think some of this, as someone who is a woman and someone who was, I was in my mid-20s, so some other folks in their mid-20s, like, we got along as friends, and that was an easy rapport. I think there were some older women who like really enjoyed just having me around so they could give me life advice and tell me all about their experiences and tell me, like, you're doing this wrong, or you should be sitting like this, or why don't you have kids yet? And like, just kind of like letting people express themselves and like being an ear, but not being an imposition. And I think that that's something where academics are not necessarily encouraged in the name of rigor to respect those boundaries. And I think for me, one of the things also that, as somebody who is not Black, was really paying attention to like, what is not mine to tell, what is not mine to share, and what are the ways that I can also like, how can I use my resources to folks' benefit, and how can I just like be an ear for people who don't feel listened to, and thinking about like how I'm telling stories, how I'm contextualizing that, and also like things that are not, that are often counter to what sociologists in particular demand, right? Like not listing people's convictions in incredible detail, which I get a lot of pushback from, like right now, where people are like, for your methods, we need you to explain all these things. You don't need to know those details about people's lives. I don't even need to know those details about people's lives to know how violent incarceration and its aftermath is, right? So I think some of this is where, again, are your commitments, and thinking about that is also central to positionality and where you think about your place in the field. And that is often counter to what the academy values. Like, you know, Dr. Gonzalez was saying earlier, you know, there are things that folks don't need to know, and the academy does a lot to legitimize whose knowledge counts. I think there were moments where, you know, I would be in the reentry home and parole and probation officers would come in. And in that context, I would sometimes be read as Black and then be subjected to different types of surveillance, right? And for me to pay attention to that, not as a moment of taking on what Blackness is, not misinterpreting that for a moment of like racial, like that, those moments of like racial interpretation, understanding that that is also just such a small window. And what I was exposed to and what I could see was also just such a small window of what that type of surveillance and punishment feels like. I think really attending to that the lack of information, that not necessarily having all the data that ethnographers are used to having, that actually is important. And it also is trusting Black folks and Black knowledges like with Black folks. And I think that there are sociologists in particular, the anti-Black history of the discipline itself, really being cognizant of that. And it's not to say that I did it perfectly or well even, but it's knowing that there are so many moments for violence in doing this type of work. And particularly anti-Black violence that, you know, folks going into the field and thinking about positionality, we really have to be not just thoughtful about, but constantly reflexive and uneasy.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank all of our panelists, and thank you, Anna, for leading us through this discussion. This was really fantastic. This was it was great to just get to listen and learn from all of you. And I really appreciate you taking time out of your evening to be here with us. And I want to flag for everyone, our next, our final session for the quarter will be May 15th on policing gender and sexuality in the age of AI. We hope you can join us, and we will be putting a recording of today's wonderful event up on our YouTube page. So thank you so much for joining us, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.